follow a rise in nationalism. Mahatma Gandhi's movement was one example of Indian nationalism that did not lead to fascism, and it is not an outlier. What is true is that because nationalistic movements have incredibly emotional and personal motivations, it does often center around a single leader who embodies and encourages those sentiments. Napoleon was loved by many as someone who championed the values of French Revolution, while Hitler advocated for German values which included duty, industry, discipline, law, sovereignty, and order. Each time, it was these things that the ordinary person felt like they were losing, either in the wake of civil unrest and the return of royalty, or in the wake of World War I. With or without this absolute figure at the head of government. Nationalism also tends to naturally result in more centralized power. In Harry Turtledove's Timeline 191, the Fascist Freedom Party seized power over the waterways, used economic planning, and worked to undermine states' rights and their power to create laws in favor of their leaders' central authority. This is a pattern we see in real fascist states as well, the government enforcing a single law, single culture, or single way of life in hopes of defending it, which requires local government to have less power to ensure they cannot undermine that. A nationalistic empire also provides a different focus for the tension in a story. Such empires tend to have an internal focus the other types of empires lack in fashioning a particular way of life for the entire country. I should note very clearly that nationalism and patriotism are not the same ideologies, and that one does have an inherent historical connection to these tendencies that the other does not. What happens to those who are part of it but don't conform? Some nationalistic empires may do nothing. Part of their nationalism may involve a wide ambit of freedom for the individual in the company of the state. However, history also ranges from expulsion to pogroms to the Holocaust. It is up to the author to determine how their empire would deal with this internal conflict. Nationalistic empires sometimes result in fascist movements with a single person at its center, but this is not required. They also often result in centralized power, but this in turn causes the issues we will discuss in Part 15 around communication and control. A nationalistic empire also allows for more of a focus on citizens in the homeland who do or don't conform, while resource security empires often focus on the conflict between those inside and outside of the homeland. How do empires expand? Technological advantage. The Romans conquered the tribes of Europe with ease through superior military tactics. The British outmatched native groups with muskets. With the Fire Nation's industrialized economy, steam-powered ships, and mechanized siege weapons, the Earth Kingdom didn't stand a chance. The Galactics in B.V. Larson's Steel World brought humanity into its empire under threat of its Hellburner weapons to which there was simply no counter. Science fiction is full of empires who conquer using superior technology, less than tactics, funnily enough. If the focus of your narrative is on the conflict your empire is in, then technological imbalance can be a complicating factor. One example of this is that the expansion of the Rashidun Caliphate was temporarily slowed by the walled cities in the Nile Delta. For a while, they did not have the siege weapons or technology to easily fight on that terrain. The question the author needs to answer is, how does their empire evolve to deal with this, or does it back down? A technological or tactical imbalance will also help determine the shape of the empire. The empire will expand to places it can easily take with its superior technology or tactics rather than face down against an enemy who can fight it on equal ground. If your empire has managed to subsume more technologically advanced peoples than itself, then the reader may wonder how such a thing was possible. Summary. 1. Empires are often driven by resources. Where certain resources are found determines where they expand to, the type of economy helps determine how they do so, and the climate and geography of the homeland are both factors to consider. Controlling a valuable resource may also give a natural center to the empire. These are more often islands. 2. Empires are often driven by security in uniting their people or taking over enemy lands to protect themselves. Defensible borders, buffer zones for the homeland, and strategic points of control help determine where the empire expands to. These are more often land-based than islands. It is also a measure of ensuring internal security by pooling resources. 3. Empires are often driven by nationalism in the wake of strife or prosperity. It is important to show this mentality in the minds of everyday citizens, as it draws on sentiments and ideas that they feel proud of or feel they are losing. It presents a challenge for protagonists who grow up in such an environment and may allow more easily for narrative focus on internal tensions. It sometimes results in fascism, but it does not need to. 4. Empires nearly always have a tactical or technological advantage against those they absorb. Part 15. How empires work. The Legend of Korra by Michael DiMartino, and Brian Konietzko. Leviathan Wakes by James S. A. Corey. The Elder Scrolls by Bethesda. The Stormlight Archives series by Brandon Sanderson. The Moat in God's Eye by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. The Last Samurai by John Logan. 1984 by George Orwell. The Star Wars series by George Lucas. The Dragon Prince by Aaron E. Haas. Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. Stargate Atlantis by Brad Wright and Robert C. Cooper. The StarCraft series by Chris Mezen. 2 Treatises of Government by John Locke. What keeps an empire working? They feature in any number of stories, particularly science fiction and fantasy, sprawling across planets, galaxies, kingdoms, and continents, but when it comes to world-building them, honestly, books have a pretty shocking track record of these amorphous powers that just exist and work because, plot. In this part, we will be looking at what creates a realistic empire, and what prevents it from collapsing. In pursuit of this, we will be focusing on the 3 Cs, communication, control, and commerce. These are the 3 pillars of an empire. Once again, the first and most important thing to do when world-building an empire is to study the accounts of real historical empires. Communication. One question to answer when thinking about your empire is how quick and effective is communication throughout the empire. There are 3 different relevant types of communication. 1. Between the different governmental powers across the empire. 2. Between government and citizens. 3. Between citizens across distances, which we will get to in our part on control. An empire's biggest advantages against its smaller enemies without and within are its ability to draw on a larger population for its military, a wider pool of resources, and a greater number of intellectuals for strategy and innovation. However, these advantages can be nullified, or at least minimized, if the empire cannot effectively coordinate and communicate quickly. Military. With larger borders than a usual state, quick and effective communication in the military is vital to bringing forces from across the state to combat rivals. One of the advantages of Kuvira's Earth Empire in The Legend of Korra is its use of trains across the Earth Kingdom. This makes communication between the provinces quick and central government a lot easier. Forces could be quickly mobilized to respond to threats. Resources. Without the ability to coordinate resources during times of drought and famine, an empire will become prone to riots, chaos, and even rebellion. The Roman Empire fell for a myriad of reasons, but the strengthening of urban centers outside Rome led to the central authority of Rome decreasing, making the coordination of resources in the Western Roman Empire a lot more difficult. As famine and plague struck Rome, the city was less equipped to deal with it, contributing to riots and its eventual sack in 410 AD. Citizens. Finally, communication to citizens is vital to the coordination of economic or governmental policy, and its implementation, legal reforms, curfews, new taxes, the ability to spread propaganda, or gather opinions and democratic votes from across the state. You must also consider how your empire maintains effective communication. This will depend heavily on the context of your empire. If your empire is land-based in a low-tech world, then consider the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. The Romans built a vast network of roads across their empire, with communication and coordination in mind. In the industrial era, trains and telegraphs became an incredibly important form of communication. In James S. A. Corey's Leviathan Wakes, communication between Earth, Mars, and the Belt is done by TIE beam, a huge laser able to transmit information across the solar system. Whatever the method of communication is in your science fiction or fantasy empire, what matters is the speed and amount of information that can easily travel. This has 2 important effects on 1. The effectiveness of central decision-making. 2. Stability and the desire for self-governance. We will get to the second effect in our part on control. When building an empire, the speed and amount of information that can travel throughout the empire will determine how the institutional power is set up, who reports to whom, where are they based, what information is delivered, how long it takes to respond, and what decisions they make based on that. Empires are huge, cumbersome creatures with 1,000 metaphorical tentacles, and 1,000,000 fingers in 1,000,000 pots. If all legal, economic, and political decisions are made by a single institutionalized power like an emperor or king, then it is likely that communication and administration will be slowed with more decisions to be made by that one body, and the time needed to communicate them back and forth. This is only made worse if communication is slow and government powers cannot send a lot of information easily. Part of the success of Tiber Septim's empire in the Elder Scrolls series is that it recognized that it would be inefficient to have an extremely strong central government. Its communication was too slow, often on horseback, and not enough information could travel to be effective. As a result, the government became relatively decentralized. While the emperor is the ultimate authority, communication and decisions are quick and effective because provinces are largely left to make their own decisions, provided they obey the law, and only a fraction of direct governance is left to the emperor himself. When things go wrong and decisions do need to be made by the central authority, it is quickly communicated, with the emperor also being situated in the geographical center of the empire. A great historical example of this is the Qing dynasty in China. The centralized power was largely limited to war, criminal proceedings, taxes, and some major industrial projects like waterways and bridges. Beyond that, management was often quite local. This is because where communicating large amounts of information is slower, a more decentralized government is often a more effective way of dealing with local issues like economic downturn, property disputes, or criminal proceedings. In contrast, quick and effective communication across the empire allows for more centralized government. Magic systems and communication. You might think this means an empire in a fantasy series with swords and horses and carriages has to have a decentralized power structure to be realistic, but some authors use their magic system to subvert this expected setup. In Sanderson's Stormlight Archives series, span reads are a comparatively fast way of transmitting large amounts of writing across great distances, allowing decisions to be made from anywhere within the kingdom with speed. This is why the governance of most of the kingdoms of the land can all spend their time at war, sending orders back even from the front lines. In your universe, perhaps magicians can project thoughts into the minds of citizens. How would this affect your use of propaganda, and would this make stopping the spread of rebellious ideas harder? Would the state make sure it hired all of these telepathic mags to work for it, creating this class of elite propagandists in society? It is important to consider how the fantastical elements in your story change how a government body would be administered. If abilities make certain duties easier or harder to carry out, this then can make your empire more effective or give it a weak point for its enemies to exploit. How quickly and effectively the government powers can respond to threats inside and outside the empire is one lens through which the author can establish setting for the reader. It is not just about military might, but about the magical, technological, and administrative elements of your empire's communication that make it able or unable to outmaneuver its enemies. Control. Mao Zedong posited in 1927, somewhat pessimistically, but realistically, that a political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. While control is vital to the legitimacy of any government in the history of mankind, the vast land masses, be it continents or planets, that some empires preside over mean that the ability to assert control in a region is especially vital. But what is control, really? It is easy to say collecting taxes is control, and while successfully collecting tax is often evidence of an empire's control, it does not actually show how an empire maintains that control. It is symptomatic and not causative. Empires form, obviously, by absorbing different people groups into the same state, and shockingly, this can cause problems because some people do not like that. In all likelihood, the people being absorbed. Because of this, in terms of world building, you as the author have to ask, why do people stay in the empire? Why do they pay their taxes? Why do they not rebel? How does it essentially shift people's allegiance or willingness to live within the empire? The favorite answer of every glorious evil empire in fiction is terror. People obey because gulag. But this raises more questions than it gives answers. An empire based on terror can leave citizens feeling like rebellion is a better option. How do they keep an expensive, widespread military presence that repeatedly needs to be replenished? Why do these people join the army anyway? When it is pretty clearly evil. Empires that have historically ruled through terror have not lasted very long. Instead, history makes it clear that successful empires often maintain control of groups they absorb, whether through peaceful means, extortionate annexation, or violent conquest, by making it preferable to be in the empire than outside it. That is the concept at the heart of a working empire, preference. This can be done in any number of ways. In the case of the British Empire, it was highly oppressive at times, but the economic opportunity and access to world trade was attractive to many people in the states it colonized. The New Zealand Maori took great advantage of this at time, trading their goods for new raw materials, tools, and weapons they needed. 43 Under the Mongol Empire, most citizens were secure and free to practice their own religion. Under Cyrus the Great, citizens were supposedly free from the threat of slavery. 44. Control and narrative. What is critical for you as the world builder and writer is that you show this within the narrative. Why people join the empire can be intimately connected to a character's motivation. In The Legend of Korra, we see that Bolin joined the Earth Empire because it brought food and supplies in times of strife to towns who needed it. This comes naturally from his compassionate character. In The Mote in God's Eye, Niven scales down the answer to this question to the experiences of the perspective character, Commander Roderick Blaine. In leading an effort to put down a rebellion, he sees what happens to societies that leave the empire. People stayed loyal to it because without it, society returned to economic collapse and disorder. This comes naturally from his jaded history. Humanity must be reunited into one government, by persuasion or by force, so that the hundreds of years of secession wars could never happen again. Every imperial officer had seen what horrors those wars brought. That was why the academies were located on Earth instead of at the capital. Most city windows were smashed already. Mobs milled in the streets. However, control is not just about controlling your average pea-picking, sweet potato peasant. In the case of dictatorships, it is about keeping the people who keep you in power wanting to be part of your dictatorship rather than anything else. The pyramid persists in any power structure. Different people at different levels of government and society have different reasons for preferring to be part of the empire, and the ruling body needs to account for the multitude of parties that keep them in power in a multitude of ways. A common character arc that subverts this in Dances with Wolves type stories like The Last Samurai is that these motivations for them to support the empire are challenged, gradually resulting in character change. Attractive inside, unattractive outside. Why people would stay in an empire is not just about making the empire attractive. It can be easier to make not living in the empire unattractive. This is where we discuss history's version of tabloid magazines, propaganda. Most authors will have heard of the oxymoronic Ministry of Truth in Orwell's 1984, which kept the population under control by filtering the information available to them, manufacturing crises, and propagating stories about how awful or evil the world outside Oceania was. This makes the population want to stay apart Oceania. Because of our recent historical relationship with propaganda, particularly through the Nazis and the Soviet Union, it is easy to imagine that any empire using propaganda is automatically an evil empire type. However, propaganda has a long history as a vital part of a successful empire, right back to Sargon of Akkad. The ability of the government to control how their expansion is viewed by the populace, how their enemies are viewed, and how their troops are viewed is powerful. 4. Example, consider how the war against the separatists is depicted in Star Wars. They are seen as barbarians against freedom and liberty, terrorists and nothing more. Propaganda does present a curious problem for writing characters who come from within the empire. Why would your characters doubt how the government depicts the opposition or the military if everyone else doesn't? In Ehas the Dragon Prince, the main character Callum does not believe elves are all monsters, and the war is justified, but there is no reason given as to why he does not when everyone else does. Especially as a child, such a viewpoint seems oddly mature. A great example of doing propaganda well is Zuko from Avatar, The Last Airbender. He genuinely believes the Fire Nation is spreading its prosperity to the world, and it takes a long and difficult journey to see through that propaganda. His eventual rejection of propaganda comes 3 seasons into the show during the Day of Black Sun Part 2, The Eclipse. Zuko, no, I've learned everything. And I've had to learn it on my own. Growing up, we were taught that the Fire Nation was the greatest civilization in history. And somehow, the war was our way of sharing our greatness with the rest of the world. What an amazing lie that was. The people of the world are terrified by the Fire Nation. They don't see our greatness. They hate us. And we deserve it. We've created an era of fear in the world. And if we don't want the world to destroy itself, we need to replace it with an era of peace and kindness. Having a character easily see through propaganda where others cannot is not bad writing, but it can feel jarring for the reader to have this magical protagonist who is infinitely wiser than everyone else. It can be more interesting to instead have seeing the reality as a part of their character change. But it is also important to remember that propaganda becomes harder to sustain when people can freely research events themselves, either through magic or technology. Maintaining the facade thus becomes increasingly more expensive for the state. Self-governance and sovereignty. Within the question of why the people do not rebel, 2 important concepts emerge: self-governance and sovereignty. How does your empire accommodate these sentiments, which have been forces of revolution all throughout history? People do not like it when they feel like they are being ruled by people they do not know, did not choose, nor have any cultural or societal kinship with. Groups of people who feel a tribalistic bond usually wish to govern themselves as a tribal group. In the modern day, we share this tribalistic bond with those in the same state, nation, or even continent, but empires by nature absorb a number of different people groups. In some fictional cases, like the Dalek Empire, 45 they rule through absolute terror, but historically, terror has rarely worked as a long-term administrative strategy. No, a more effective strategy is actually allowing self-governance. Alexander the Great permitted rulers of conquered provinces to remain in their position if they paid their taxes. In your fictional empire, this could mean not lopping the head off the king that the conquered people really love, appointing one of their noble house heads as governors, creating a local democratic body that is subordinate to the central authority, but is allowed to make decisions, or giving them a path to citizenship with growing benefits along the way that they would not have had before. What matters, above all, is that the people feel that when issues around their home are raised, they are actually heard and addressed. It is because of this that it is much easier to grow. Acceptance of your empire's authority with some degree of decentralized government. It helps with that feeling of sovereignty over their own lands and affairs, and thus they are less likely to rebel. This is where we discuss what the speed and amount of communication between citizens means for government control, stability, and the desire for self-governance. Superior science fiction technology or advanced magic can make communication over long distances extremely fast, like how Scions can act like phones in Sanderson's Elantris, or the Stargate technology of the ancients in Stargate Atlantis, which allowed instant digital communication across light years through wormholes. This means that 1. Urgency is not necessarily present if the central power can immediately receive information and decide things. This means they do not have the same practical motivation to decentralize the empire as they would if communication was slow. 2. More importantly for this discussion, in these worlds where information easily travels, the notion of a self-governance begins to change as what people consider their tribe changes. Through ease of travel and instant communication, it is more than just their village, but they feel connected to their whole state, nation, and maybe one day entire planet in the case of galactic senates, and the like. The result of accelerated communication is that people are often more willing to accept a higher level of centralized power because it is still self-governance, as long as that authority comes from that now wider community they consider themselves part of. For example, where we would have once considered our suburb or small village our tribe, the invention of cars means we identify more easily with our wider city because we feel connected to them as a people. Rebellion. Even an economically sound and attractive empire will have its insurgents whose greatest advantage in rebellion is the ability to strike quickly. With a larger border and landmass, a vital element of control is being able to respond to threats within and without swiftly. If an empire cannot mobilize forces quickly, then it effectively gives insurgents time to rebel and set up an effective defense, by which time they are essentially fighting an independent state. This is closely connected to the communication factors we discussed before. In the case of empires that span planets or galaxies, this becomes a problem when enemies are light years away. What is truly preventing people from repeatedly rebelling? It would require an almost perpetual military presence without another solution. Solving this problem is partly why the Protoss Empire from StarCraft was so effective. Using warp gates, they could teleport troops anywhere around the Empire almost instantly, nullifying the advantage any resistance would have in assembling quickly. Likewise, the Mongol Empire was known for how swiftly it could move forces, attacking days or weeks earlier than expected, and the Romans built a whole network of roads to aid swift troop movement throughout the empire. If your empire can put down those who do not pay taxes quickly, they will decrease the likelihood of rebellion in the future. Assimilation. Another method of control is assimilation. This is helping absorbed peoples prefer to be part of the empire through creating a unifying cultural identity they are a part of. This is often done in two ways. 1. Imposing an ideology, commonly a religion. We see this in Warhammer 40k in conquered peoples having to recognize the imperial cult as their religion. Likewise, the early Rashidun Caliphate made taxes and social standing more appealing for those who chose to be Muslim. 2. Introducing unifying cultural practices. Rome created the Colosseum with this in mind. It created a sport all peoples could get behind and appreciate, part of the Roman cultural identity. Creating unifying activities or imposing certain practices on absorbed peoples creates a new cultural identity that becomes stronger the more ingrained these practices become. They can help people feel part of the empire, and they may even take pride in participating in them. However, making these practices too cumbersome can also have the opposite effect and be oppressive. Commerce. Economic stability of a given area is one of the greatest indicators of crime, rebellion, and peace, and there is a good reason for that. It is not like people are not concerned with what their country is doing overseas or how much corruption there is at the higher levels of government, but if they have a good job, a stable income, and prospects for the future, then they are more likely to turn a blind eye. To the average squalling peasant, it matters less to them whether their tax money is heading to Narnia or the Teletubbies Parliament. It's just another person going, "I'm your king." Commerce is closely connected to communication, as well. Traveling merchants have historically played the role of messengers, bringing news and tidings from afar. One of the big advantages of an empire is that it has the opportunity for a wider market to buy and sell to, often with lower tariffs. 46. The ability to communicate easily at distance makes trading easier, and the market more competitive, meaning that overall, people tend to be more economically prosperous. However, the government has a bigger role than not taxing people to death. To draw on John Locke's two treatises of government, a large reason people want to be part of the civil state, in this case the empire, is that it protects property and facilitates trade. This can be done in any number of ways. The Qing dynasty distributed licenses to traders to help the populace know who to trust. The Romans stamped goods like oils to officiate them when shipped throughout the empire to help people know when they were being tricked, and the ability to take claims against another individual in a fair court system is critical to a functioning free economy. The sad thing is that there are not really many examples of fictional empires being shown to facilitate and protect trade. The Cyrodiilic Empire in the Elder Scrolls does pretty much everything the ancient Romans did, but nothing unique. If you are looking to distinguish your empire from others in fiction, then perhaps showing how your empire regulates and protects commerce would establish it as a realistic empire through a unique lens. It would establish why people prefer to be a part of it, why it has survived, and what it does that other states around it do not. Empires and change. One thing to be aware of as a writer when world-building realistic empires is that they change constantly. One relatively good example of this on the largest possible scale is the Imperium of Man in Warhammer 40k. This million-planet-wide empire is so big that it barely holds together. There's opposition to the Council of Terror and widespread rebellion in the Horus Heresy. The whole system of government was destroyed in the Great Scouring, and its military and economy are repeatedly collapsing, being formed and reformed, territory being lost and gained and split between powers. Overall, it could hardly be called a contiguous empire for all it has changed across the years. The Roman Empire is often imagined as this cohesive and stable political body, but, to be honest, its history is so tumultuous that to call it a single political entity would be a reductionist approach to history. There is no single arc to its history. It had repeated trials, collapses, and reformations with powers claiming to be its successors for hundreds, even thousands of years. History is never simple, and empires are nearly never perfectly stable. Empires go through changes in borders, religion, politics, economy, and culture, and it is important to show this change in the environment with evidence of that past. Perhaps there are monuments to figures of the old predominant religion, or the architecture of the marketplaces is meant to facilitate an old kind of trade the empire no longer needs. Perhaps the roads are built to reach certain mines which have since run dry. If the empire begins to lose any of the three Cs, communication, control, or commerce, then it becomes more likely that it will fracture and collapse. Within this, it is important to keep in mind how the events of the story affect each of these things, changing how the empire operates, weakening or strengthening it. If the rebellion destroys what they see as a vital target, but the reader sees no change in the empire's ability to communicate or coordinate resources, then it can feel like was no consequence to that dramatic beat. We will discuss this more in part 16. Summary. 1. The speed and amount of communication across an empire is vital to effective coordination. This can be altered by magic or technology. Slower communication often results in decentralized power. 2. It is important to consider how the magic system affects how the government works and the challenges that it faces. 3. An empire can establish control through terror, making it preferable to be part of it, propaganda about the inside and outside, allowing self-governance, creating a feeling of sovereignty, and assimilation. The capacity to mobilize troops quickly and coordinate resources is crucial to control. Speedier communication between citizens may make them more willing to accept more centralized control. 4. A healthy economy is an indicator of stability for an empire, and a wider market may make its citizens better off than those outside the empire. Successful empires often protect property rights and facilitate trade. 5. Empires change in culture, economy, politics, and religious makeup, and it can help with realism for its description to reflect that in your world building. Part 16. How Empires Fall. Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins, The A Song of Ice and Fire series by G.R. Martin, Avatar, The Last Airbender by Michael D. Martino and Brian Konietzko, Mistborn, The Final